The morning light in Tullamore, County Offaly, doesn't shine the same way it did in 1996. There's something about that year. A shadow still lingers in its sunrises. It creeps through quiet residential streets and sits heavy on the shoulders of a town that learned how quickly silence can become unbearable. In a small upstairs flat on Church Street, a young woman disappeared without a sound. No break-in, no blood, no sign of struggle, just gone. Her name was Fiona Pender. She was 25, a hairdresser, a part-time model, 7 months pregnant, and loved, deeply loved, by her family and the town she called home. On a late August morning, she simply vanished. She left behind folded baby clothes, her handbag, her toothbrush, even her shoes. There were no cries for help, no cameras, no closure, only a mother who refused to stop looking, a brother whose grief would later take his own life, and a country left to whisper about a curse, a shadow zone known as the Vanishing Triangle. For decades, Fiona's case has haunted Ireland, not just because of how little is known, but because of how much pain still echoes from her absence. Years passed, leads came and went, anonymous calls, false confessions, woodland searches with cadaver dogs, and yet not a single arrest, not one verified answer. What happened to Fiona Pender? Why was her apartment untouched? Why did no one see her leave? And why, in a case so emotionally raw and publicly followed, does the truth still remain buried beneath layers of time and silence? Her name still appears on posters. Her photograph, a soft, natural smile framed by dark eyes, still stares back from news archives. She would have been a mother now, perhaps a grandmother, but instead her family mourns without a grave. To this day, no one has been charged, no remains have been found. And yet, in the collective memory of Ireland, Fiona's name is not forgotten. It's carved into the landscape of mystery, grief, and unresolved pain. She is not alone in that darkness. In the 1990s, a series of women disappeared under eerily similar circumstances, vanishing from quiet towns and rural roadsides. The press began calling it the Vanishing Triangle. But this isn't folklore. This is loss. This is reality. This is Fiona. And her story is not just about one woman, it's about what happens when time forgets, and what's left behind when justice never knocks on the door. But to understand what really happened, to trace the steps that led to this impossible silence, we have to go back to where it all began, to who Fiona Pender truly was, and what happened on that quiet August morning in 1996, before she vanished, before the country whispered her name into late-night radios and pub conversations. Fiona Pender was just Fiona. She lived a quiet but vibrant life in the heart of Ireland, in Tullamore, a town of just over 10,000 people back then. The kind of place where people still nodded at one another on the street, where neighbors knew each other's dogs and routines, and where everyone still read the local paper with intent. A town rooted in tradition, wrapped in silence, and now stained with a story it never asked for. Fiona grew up just outside the town, surrounded by fields and family. The Penders were known, not wealthy or influential, but respected. Her father, Sean, had died when she was young. Her mother, Josephine, carried the weight of that loss like many Irish women did, quietly, resiliently, with hands that always had work to do. Fiona was the only daughter. She had 2 brothers, Mark and John. Mark, the older of the 2, was a Garda, a member of Ireland's National Police Service. He would later become one of the loudest voices calling for justice after her disappearance. But back then, he was simply her protector. Those close to Fiona remember her as gentle but determined. She wasn't the loudest in the room, but she left an impression, a kind of warm elegance. She had a signature way of brushing her hair behind her ear when she was nervous, a small human tic that would one day haunt those who could still picture it perfectly. She trained as a hairdresser and worked at a local salon, where regulars came not just for a trim, but for the feeling of being seen. Fiona had a way of listening without judging, the kind of person people confided in without realizing they were doing it. She also did part-time modeling work, not for fame, not for the spotlight, but because she enjoyed it. A quiet confidence behind the lens, beauty with no trace of vanity. She had dreams, people say, but not wild ones. A good home, a steady life, a future for her child. Because when Fiona disappeared, she was 7 months pregnant. She had already picked out baby names, already folded tiny clothes into drawers, already stood in the mirror tracing her fingers across the curve of a life forming inside her. The father of the child was her partner, at the time a man named John Thompson. They had lived together in that flat on Church Street for just under a year. The relationship, some say, was rocky, but Fiona never made drama out of discomfort. She was private, loyal, quiet even in pain. That apartment was modest. Upstairs, above a row of businesses, a simple front door, a narrow staircase, a single window looking out onto the street below. Neighbors came and went. Life moved on. No one imagined that it would become the last known place Fiona was seen. She had plans, a hospital bag already half-packed, a cot she and her mother had picked out, a vision of herself not as a model or hairdresser, but as a mother. She was preparing, she was living, and she wasn't alone. Her mother, Josephine, was deeply involved, always visiting, always helping. They had a close bond, the kind only shared between two women who had weathered loss and still found reasons to smile. The town knew Fiona, not as a headline, but as a neighbor, a client, a friend. You'd see her walking to the shops, sitting quietly at Mass, waiting in line at the pharmacy with her hand gently resting on her stomach. There was no reason, not then, to think anything was wrong. But sometimes, in hindsight, people look back with searching eyes. They wonder about little things they didn't notice. A word unspoken, a look exchanged, an unease that felt small at the time but now seems massive. Was Fiona worried? Did she confide in anyone? Was there fear behind her soft smile? The truth is, no one knows for sure. Because Fiona, like so many women, carried things quietly. She trusted people she loved. She hoped for a future she deserved. And Tullamore, for all its beauty and quietness, would become a town defined by that trust being broken. Because in the summer of 1996, Fiona Pender was alive, expecting, planning. She had no idea that the world would remember her not for her life, but for the silence that followed it. It was late August, 1996. Tullamore was still holding on to summer, the kind of warmth that lingered on windowsills and made shadows stretch long across the town square. Shops were open. Families walked the canal paths. It was the kind of week where everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. The last confirmed sighting of Fiona Pender was on the morning of Wednesday, August 23rd. She had spent the night at her flat on Church Street, shared with her boyfriend, John Thompson. According to Thompson, she was still in the apartment when he left for work that morning around 6:30 a.m. She was reportedly in bed, resting. That was the last time anyone ever saw her. No one saw her leave the apartment. No one saw her in town that day. No calls, no visits, no activity on her bank account, no sign of a struggle in the apartment, no signs at all. She simply vanished. Her mother, Josephine, had visited the day before. She had helped Fiona prepare more things for the baby, folding tiny blankets, discussing birth plans, gently teasing her daughter about possible baby names. Fiona had seemed tired but excited. Nothing out of the ordinary, no fear in her voice, no farewell in her eyes. And that's what makes what happened next so haunting. Later that day, Wednesday, Josephine tried to call Fiona. No answer. At first she thought nothing of it. Fiona might have gone out, maybe to the shops, maybe resting. But then Thursday came. No word, no visit, no call back. And Josephine felt it. That weight in the chest, that silent alarm only a mother can truly hear. By Friday she went to the apartment. The door was locked. Everything inside was untouched. Fiona's handbag was still there, with her wallet, keys, and personal belongings. Her makeup bag was neatly placed on the bathroom counter. Her maternity clothes were hanging in the closet. Even the cigarettes she smoked occasionally were still on the table. There was no sign of a struggle, no mess, no broken window, no note. It looked as if Fiona had just stepped out, maybe for a moment, and never returned. But Fiona wouldn't have left without her things. She wouldn't have left her baby, and she wouldn't have left her mother in silence. Josephine went to the Gardaí, Ireland's national police, and reported her daughter missing. At first there was hesitation. Fiona was an adult. No known enemies, no signs of distress. There was no immediate evidence of foul play, no camera footage, no suspicious sightings. But Josephine insisted, "My daughter wouldn't just walk away." The search began, but it was slow, halting, and painfully ordinary. There were no mobile phones to track then, no CCTV in most of the town. Fiona's social circle was small, her movements quiet. The investigation was working blind. Posters went up, calls were made, friends were questioned. Her partner, John Thompson, was interviewed multiple times. He claimed he had no idea what happened. He said he'd left her in the flat that morning and returned later to find her gone. He appeared calm. He cooperated, but something wasn't right. Not to the Pender family, not to Josephine. She believed from the very beginning that someone knew what happened, and that they weren't talking. In the days that followed, the media picked up the story. A young, pregnant woman vanished without a trace. The headlines were soft at first, speculative, cautious, but as days turned to weeks, the urgency grew. Ireland began to whisper, "Another one?" Fiona's disappearance bore eerie similarities to other cases, other women, who had vanished in the 1990s. All in the same region, all without witnesses, all without closure. By now, the Gardaí began to suspect foul play. But with no body, no weapon, and no suspect, they were chasing smoke. Search teams combed the Grand Canal, local woodlands, and even boglands, looking for signs of disturbed ground. Nothing. A local psychic even offered visions. Desperate tips poured in from across the country. Still, nothing. Her brother Mark, a Garda himself, was tormented. The lines between professional duty and personal grief blurred fast. He would go on to search independently, placing signs, knocking doors, begging for witnesses. The days stretched into months, and the silence that followed Fiona's disappearance became heavier than any grave. People talked, suspicions floated, but in the official record there was only this: August 23rd, 1996. A woman, 7 months pregnant, loving, warm, full of life, simply disappeared, and the apartment remained still, like a frozen memory, like a room waiting for someone who would never come home. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and then years. In Tullamore, time did what it always does. Shops reopened, children returned to school, church bells rang, life, unwillingly, moved on. But for Josephine Pender, every ticking second was a reminder of something missing, someone missing. Her daughter, her grandchild, the life that should have grown louder, had instead vanished into quiet. Every morning Josephine sat by the phone, for a call, for a voice, for a sound that might break the nightmare, and every night she lay in bed with the unbearable weight of unanswered prayers. She kept Fiona's bedroom untouched, as if she might walk in at any moment. The clothes stayed folded. The brush on the dresser was never moved, her maternity bag still packed. But silence is cruel, because over time, silence doesn't just stay. It grows. It fills corners. It wraps around every word not said. The media, once fierce, began to look elsewhere. Other tragedies, other headlines. But Josephine refused to let the world forget. She printed thousands of missing posters, Fiona's smile beneath the bold word, missing. She walked neighborhoods, talked to strangers, pleaded on national radio. "Somebody knows something," she said once in an interview. "Even if they think it's nothing, it could mean everything." But nothing came. Over the years, tips trickled in. Strange sightings, rumors, a woman matching Fiona's description at a bus station, a call from a psychic in Limerick, a claim from a man in custody, quickly dismissed as fabrication. Each time the phone rang, Josephine hoped. Each time it ended in disappointment, her hope cracked further. And for Mark, Fiona's brother and a Garda himself, the grief took a different shape. One mixed with rage. He knew the system. He knew how cases went cold. But this wasn't just another case. This was his sister. He followed every angle, spoke to colleagues, pushed for leads. He walked fields alone, stood in silence at the Grand Canal, staring at the water. It haunted him, and eventually it destroyed him. In 2000, just 4 years after Fiona disappeared, Mark Pender took his own life. Those close to him said he never recovered from the guilt, that he was a Garda and still couldn't protect her, that he had sworn to uphold justice and still felt powerless against the silence. And with Mark's death, the Pender family lost a second child. Fiona's disappearance had already shattered their world. Now it fractured beyond repair. Tullamore, too, changed. People locked their doors more. They watched each other with longer glances. Parents held their children tighter. And yet, Fiona's name was rarely spoken aloud, not because she was forgotten, but because remembering her meant remembering the fear. Every August 23rd, Josephine lit a candle. She stood quietly in Fiona's bedroom, staring at the small framed photo on the wall, a photo taken just weeks before the disappearance. "I still see her," she told reporters once. "Sometimes in my dreams, sometimes in the street when someone walks like her. But she never speaks." Over time, the Gardaí reviewed the case again. New officers came, cold case units were formed, but no major development surfaced, no body, no confession, no peace. And so, the years kept passing. The world got louder, new technology, new stories, new fears. But in the house on the outskirts of Tullamore, time stood still. Josephine once said, "There is no moving on. There's only moving around the pain." And around that pain, she kept Fiona alive. Every news appeal, every radio call-in. Every time a journalist asked, she answered. She kept her daughter's name in the public eye, even when the public began to look away. Some families find closure, some never do. The Penders became a symbol of the second kind, not just of loss, but of endurance, of surviving a wound that never closes, of learning to breathe through the silence. Because Fiona Pender didn't vanish in 1996. She vanished every day after that, too. Every birthday not celebrated, every baby milestone that never came, every moment her mother woke up and remembered. The time without answers was not empty. It was full of grief, of waiting, of wondering. And in that silence, in that unrelenting ache, the mystery of Fiona Pender became something even heavier than a crime. It became absence, permanent and punishing. In a case like Fiona Pender's, silence doesn't stay empty. It fills with voices, with questions, possibilities, and theories. Some grounded, in fact, others spun from desperation. But all of them trying to explain the same impossible question. How does a woman, 7 months pregnant, vanish from her home in a town where everyone knows everyone? As time passed and the investigation stalled, the Gardaí and the public began to look deeper. One theory rose above the rest. Fiona never left that flat on her own. Authorities considered the timeline, the fact that her belongings were untouched. No wallet, no keys, no sign of departure. A heavily pregnant woman wouldn't simply walk out, barefoot and without essentials. If she didn't leave by choice, someone had to have removed her. Likely someone she knew. Someone who didn't need to force their way in. Suspicion inevitably fell on John Thompson, Fiona's boyfriend and the father of her unborn child. He was, by his own account, the last person to see her. He told Gardaí he left her asleep in bed around 6:30 a.m. before heading to work. When he returned later, she was gone. But something about that never sat right with Fiona's family, especially with Josephine. She later told media, "I never liked him. I never trusted him. Something about him was off." Thompson had a reputation. Local reports and those who knew the couple described their relationship as volatile. Fiona had allegedly confided in close friends that things weren't going well, and she had considered leaving him. But she stayed, perhaps hoping things would change for the sake of the baby. There were also rumors of domestic violence, though Fiona never filed a formal complaint. Still, no forensic evidence tied Thompson to a crime. No confession, no witnesses. He cooperated with the Gardaí at first, but over the years grew silent. He has never been charged. Despite growing suspicion, Gardaí couldn't legally act on feelings alone. Without a body, without evidence of a crime, there was no way to prove what happened inside that apartment. And then came another possibility. A theory tied not just to Fiona, but to a wider and more chilling pattern, the Vanishing Triangle. In the 1990s, at least 8 women disappeared from towns and counties in eastern Ireland: Kildare, Loa, Wicklow, Offaly. Most were in their 20s. All vanished without trace. No bodies, no suspects, no answers. They were Jojo Dullard, 1995, Annie McCarrick, 1993, Deirdre Jacob, 1998. And others, just like Fiona, young, independent women living quiet lives in rural or suburban towns. Some investigators began to whisper what many feared. A serial offender might be responsible. Someone who knew the roads, the routines, the blind spots. Could Fiona have been part of that pattern? The Gardaí never formally confirmed the Vanishing Triangle as connected cases, but the similarities were too chilling to ignore. The problem was, again, a lack of forensic evidence. No common suspect, no identical method, just patterns, echoes, fear. Then there were those who wondered if Fiona had left voluntarily, a theory quickly dismissed by her family. She had no money with her, no transport, and no reason. She was excited about becoming a mother. She was preparing for birth. "Fiona didn't run," Josephine said once. "She was taken." There was also speculation, especially in the early 2000s, that someone had helped cover it up. Some suggested local figures had knowledge they didn't share, that fear, shame, or loyalty prevented the truth from surfacing. In 2008, an anonymous letter was sent to the Gardaí, claiming that Fiona's remains were buried in woodland near Mount Mellick, not far from Tullamore. Search teams and cadaver dogs combed the area. Again, nothing. The case remained open, but frozen. Every new tip offered hope. Every false lead reopened wounds. And still, The biggest questions remained unanswered. Did Fiona die inside that apartment? Was it personal? A domestic tragedy covered in silence? Or was it something larger, something darker, hidden in plain sight? Theories do one thing very well. They fill the gap left by the unknown. But in Fiona Pender's case, they also remind us of how fragile truth can be when no one speaks. Someone, somewhere, knows what happened that day. Someone has lived with it, perhaps quietly, perhaps ashamed, perhaps waiting for time to bury it for good. But Fiona's family never stopped looking, and those questions, still unanswered, echo louder than ever. It was early 2008, nearly 12 years after Fiona Pender vanished. By now, the case had grown cold. Not forgotten, never that, but dormant. People still remembered her face, her smile. But the search had lost its urgency, the trail, its scent. Even the most determined investigators had run out of ground to cover. And then something changed. A letter arrived at a Garda station, typed, anonymous. It claimed to know where Fiona's body was buried. The tip was specific, a patch of remote woodland near Mount Mellick, just under 30 kilometers from Tullamore. The sender gave coordinates, not vague descriptions, but precise directions. At first, officers were skeptical. False leads had come in before, dozens of them. Psychics, pranksters, people chasing attention. But something about this letter felt different. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't begging for fame. It was cold, clinical, calculated, enough to prompt action. In February 2008, Gardaí began quietly preparing for what would become one of the most extensive digs ever undertaken in a missing persons case in Ireland. They brought in cadaver dogs from the UK, specially trained to detect the scent of human remains, even decades old. They didn't go public at first. They didn't want a media circus. If Fiona was there, if this was finally the break they'd waited for, they wanted to find her with dignity. But the secret didn't hold. Word leaked, and the press descended. Suddenly, the headlines screamed, "Major development in Fiona Pender case. Woodland searched for remains of missing woman." And for a moment, just a flicker in the noise of a loud world, Fiona Pender's name echoed again. People across Ireland stopped, watched, hoped. Josephine waited in silence. She didn't go to the site. She couldn't. She stayed at home, staring at the phone, not sure whether she should pray for discovery or for another cruel silence. Because finding Fiona would mean finding her body, finding her baby. It would mean the unthinkable had happened, and was finally undeniable. For weeks, the search continued. Excavators tore through frozen soil. Forensic teams combed through every inch of earth. They searched old wells, shallow graves, natural sinkholes. The dogs barked. Cameras flashed. Investigators moved with the weight of a nation watching. And then, nothing. No bones, no clothing, no trace. The anonymous tip, like so many before it, led only to more questions. The Gardaí never revealed whether they traced the letter's origin. They never confirmed if they believed it was a genuine attempt at closure, or something crueler. But for Josephine, it was one more hope crushed, one more door that opened and slammed shut just as fast. She later told a reporter, "For 2 weeks, I let myself believe it might be over, that I might finally bring her home. And now, I don't know if I can go through that again." But something else happened during those weeks, something no search dog or shovel could uncover. The country remembered. Talk shows aired her photo again. Newspapers printed retrospectives. The younger generation, many of whom were children when she vanished, learned her name for the first time. And it reminded people of something dangerous, that there are stories that don't end, that there are people still walking among us who carry secrets deeper than any grave. It wasn't a breakthrough. It wasn't justice. But it was a signal, a flare in the dark. Fiona's case wasn't over, and for all the time that had passed, she was still waiting to be found. When the soil of Mount Mellick gave up no secrets, the cameras left, the headlines faded, and Ireland exhaled, not in relief, but resignation. But not everyone moved on. Inside the Gardaí, the Fiona Pender case file was reopened, not just in form, but in focus. That failed 2008 dig did more than disappoint. It reignited questions long buried. And behind the scenes, a small number of determined officers began going back through everything. They reopened interviews, re-examined timelines, reviewed every word from old statements, not just what was said, but what was left out. There were new tools now, new forensic methods, new psychological profiling models. DNA analysis had advanced. Geographic profiling could identify potential disposal areas, and for the first time, cold case units were being properly resourced. But time was the enemy. 12 years had passed. Witnesses moved. Memories blurred. Some people had died. Still, they pressed on. They went back to Church Street, retracing Fiona's last known movements. That modest upstairs flat, once ordinary, had become a relic of unanswered tragedy. The building had changed owners. The apartment was renovated, but officers still stood in the same space, imagining the final moments. What had Fiona seen that morning? Was there an argument? Did someone knock on the door? Did she ever make it out? Investigators re-interviewed John Thompson, who maintained the same story. He left for work early. She was asleep. He returned later. She was gone. But details matter. In the original interviews, Thompson said he went to work around 6:30 a.m., but colleagues reportedly told Gardaí he arrived later than usual that day. Could there have been a delay? Could he have returned to the apartment? Nothing was proven. No charges were filed. But the doubts remained. Stronger now. The Gardaí also revisited the Vanishing Triangle theory. Could a single predator be responsible? They compared cases looking for overlaps, inconsistencies, links between victims. They mapped disappearances, searched for patterns, transport lines, cell phone towers, witness statements. But again, nothing definitive. Fiona's case was unique in one major way. She was 7 months pregnant. There was no sign of abduction from the street, no missing car, no scene of struggle. It had to be someone close, someone inside the circle, someone who knew her routine. And that's where the pressure focused. But even pressure can't force truth to the surface if the evidence isn't there. Then came another wave of public interest, this time from true crime podcasts and documentaries. Independent journalists, bloggers, and amateur sleuths began telling Fiona's story. Not with authority, but with curiosity. They mapped out theories, analyzed the Garda timeline. Some even traveled to Tullamore to document the locations firsthand. For Josephine, it was bittersweet. "I want the world to know her," she once said, "but I don't want her story to be entertainment. I want justice." Still, the attention mattered. It brought new tips, some vague, some promising. One caller claimed to have overheard a confession in a Dublin pub years earlier. Another said they'd seen something strange near the canal that August morning. But like so many before, none of it held up under scrutiny. Behind the scenes, Gardaí did something rare. They requested a criminal behavior analysis from external experts, not just to profile a suspect, but to evaluate the likeliest scenario. Their conclusion? Fiona was most likely killed on the day of her disappearance, most likely inside the apartment, and most likely by someone known to her. The hardest part? They'd probably never find the body. Whoever did it had time, hours perhaps, before anyone raised the alarm. Tullamore is surrounded by dense woodland, canals, bogland, and quarries, thousands of places to hide a body, especially in 1996 before surveillance, before tracking. And after 12 years, those places had only grown darker. But the case file remained open, the investigation active. And while no arrests were made, something had shifted. A national cold case team listed Fiona's disappearance as one of its top priority files. Local Gardaí were ordered to stay in contact with the Pender family. And most importantly, Fiona's name was no longer a memory. It was a mission. There is no dramatic arrest, no courtroom confession, no recovered remains that brought the mystery to an end. And yet, something was revealed, not in the form of hard evidence or a conclusive headline, but in the quiet accumulation of what we now know to be true. Over the years, investigators began to speak more plainly, off the record at first, then later in interviews. Privately, many Gardaí who worked the case came to believe that Fiona Pender was murdered on the day she disappeared, most likely inside her apartment. That the scene was staged, or at least untouched, to avoid suspicion. That her body was removed before anyone knew to look. They believe it was not a stranger, not a serial predator, but someone close, someone trusted. That is the most chilling truth of all. And though no formal charges were ever brought, one name remained central. John Thompson, Fiona's boyfriend at the time, and the father of her unborn child. He was the last person to see her. He gave statements, he cooperated, but there were cracks in his timeline, discrepancies, witnesses who remembered tension between the two, rumors of control, of anger, of Fiona wanting to leave him, perhaps just before the baby arrived. Josephine never hid her belief. She told journalists, "I know in my heart who did this. I've always known, but knowing and proving are two different things." The Gardaí interviewed Thompson again during the reopened case phase. He stuck to his story, and without evidence, they couldn't move further. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no body, no witness. In the eyes of the law, there was no crime scene, but in the eyes of Fiona's family, there was no doubt. In 2014, nearly 2 decades after Fiona disappeared, a former Garda detective gave a rare interview. He said, "There are cases where you don't just suspect someone. You know, you feel it in the pit of your stomach. But the law doesn't work on instinct, and that's what haunts us." So, what was finally revealed? Not the who, not the where, but the how. Fiona Pender's disappearance was not random. It was not a vanishing act. It was a carefully concealed act of violence, one that succeeded because it happened before anyone was watching, because she was alone, because she trusted someone, because by the time people started asking questions, it was too late. And in the end, justice, the formal kind, never came. But truth, in some ways, did. In 2017, on the anniversary of Fiona's disappearance, a Garda spokesperson made a rare, public statement. "We believe Fiona was the victim of a violent crime. We believe someone knows where her remains are located, and we urge that person, even now, to come forward." It wasn't just a plea. It was a quiet admission that after 2 decades, the Gardaí were no longer chasing every theory. They had a conclusion, if not a conviction, that Fiona had been murdered, that her body had been hidden, and that the person who did it had walked free for over 20 years. For Josephine, it wasn't enough. She wanted her daughter's body. She wanted to bury her child. She wanted to hold her grandchild's memory in her hands. But she didn't get that. She only got silence, sharpened by time and tragedy. Still, she continued to speak. In every interview, she said the same thing. "Just tell me where she is. That's all I want now. Just let me bring her home." That's what was finally revealed. That Fiona's story wasn't just a mystery. It was a stolen future, a silenced life, a truth known but never spoken aloud in court, and that sometimes the closest we get to justice is naming the pain for what it truly is. Even now, nearly 3 decades later, Fiona Pender's name carries a weight that silence can't erase. Because while much was revealed, so much more remains unknown. And what haunts this story isn't just the lack of justice. It's the space where truth should live, but doesn't. There are questions that still echo, quiet but piercing, in every conversation about Fiona. Why hasn't anyone talked? Tullamore is not a city of strangers. It's a town where people notice things, where secrets rarely survive long, and yet no one has come forward with the truth, not fully. Was it fear? Loyalty? Shame? Someone helped cover this up, or chose to look away. Someone knows where Fiona's body is and has chosen silence for nearly 30 years. That, more than anything, is the cruelty that lingers. Because her mother didn't just lose a daughter, she lost peace. Every night, Josephine laid her head down with a question instead of an answer. Not why, but where? Where is she? Where is Fiona Pender's final resting place? Some believe she was buried deep in Offaly's bogland, in places where the earth itself protects secrets. Others believe she was moved after the disappearance, perhaps more than once. There were even rumors of construction sites, abandoned wells, or private land disturbed just enough. But no one knows, and as the years passed, the search areas only expanded, while the hope narrowed. Another haunting truth: the system wasn't built for someone like Fiona. A pregnant woman disappears, and the investigation starts slow, stalls early, and gets buried in protocol. No suspects, no body, no trial, and the weight of proving anything, the burden, fell not on law enforcement, but on her family, on Josephine, who spent the rest of her life fighting for the bare minimum: acknowledgement. There is also what this case left behind in Ireland's memory: the idea of the Vanishing Triangle, a term that should have sparked national urgency, instead became mythologized, whispered about like folklore. But these were real women, real families, and real pain. Fiona was part of a pattern. Whether by coincidence or connection, she became a symbol, not just of loss, but of the invisibility of missing women, especially those whose stories don't end neatly. And then there's the baby. It's easy to forget. But Fiona wasn't the only life lost. She was 7 months pregnant. She had named the child. She had folded the clothes. She had made the plans. And when someone took her, they also took that child. A child who never had a chance. A child who would be nearly 30 years old today. No one was ever charged for that life either. In Ireland, the legal system did not, and still does not fully, treat the death of an unborn child as a separate murder in cases like Fiona's. That debate, too, has simmered in the years since. And finally, what haunts most is the sound. The sound of Fiona's name spoken only in past tense. The sound of her mother's voice, weakened by years, but still clear in interviews, still asking the same thing: "Tell me where she is." But no one did. And when Josephine Pender died in 2017, she took that heartbreak with her, unanswered, unresolved. At her funeral, a photograph of Fiona was placed beside her casket. 2 women, now reunited only by memory. One mother, who never stopped searching. One daughter, still waiting to be found, and that's what remains. A mother's grief, a brother's torment, a name etched into a list of the missing, but never erased from the hearts of those left behind. The Fiona Pender case haunts Ireland not because of its violence, but because of its vacuum, because a life that should have bloomed simply vanished, and those responsible have never spoken a word. After the silence, came the scars. Even without formal justice, Fiona Pender's disappearance left a permanent mark, not just on her family, but on a town, a country, and a system that had to learn how to carry a story with no ending. In Tullamore, Fiona's name still hangs in the air like unfinished prayer. There are no plaques on Church Street, no official memorial at the apartment where she was last seen. But people remember. Neighbors walk past that building and still glance up. Younger generations ask questions, and those old enough to remember 1996 remember everything. They remember the search posters, the candlelight vigils, the ache on Josephine Pender's face every time she walked through, the town square, and they remember what the town became in the years after Fiona vanished, a place where trust turned cautious, where doors were locked a little sooner, and where silence began to mean something more. But it wasn't just the community that changed. The Pender family, what was left of it, lived inside that grief every day. After Fiona's disappearance, Josephine never stopped campaigning. She appeared on radio shows, news broadcasts, TV specials, and in documentaries. Each time she spoke, it was with a quiet kind of strength, the strength of a woman who had already lost everything and therefore feared nothing. She became an unofficial spokesperson for families of the missing in Ireland. Other mothers would write to her, call her, sit with her in silence. They didn't need words. Grief, when it runs that deep, speaks without sound, and even when Josephine became ill, even when her health declined, she still made her voice known. In 2014, she recorded a televised appeal, tired, soft-spoken, but unwavering. Her message was clear. If you know where my daughter is, please, let me bring her home before I leave this world. But no one came forward, and when she passed in 2017, the country mourned not just her death, but the end of a chapter, the final heartbeat of a mother's fight. At her funeral, Fiona's name was spoken aloud again, not as a memory, but as a mission. Because Josephine's final request had not been fulfilled, but her strength lived on. In the years that followed, Irish legislators began revisiting how missing persons cases were handled. There were calls to fund cold case units permanently, to create a centralized DNA database, and to standardize early response protocols. Fiona's case was often cited. Journalists called her the soul of the Vanishing Triangle. Her story became a case study in criminology classes. Documentaries revisited the timeline, the dig sites, the unanswered questions. And in online forums, digital archives, and podcast episodes, Fiona's name kept returning. She never got justice, but she got something else, something harder to measure. She became a reason to do better. And for those who knew her, that mattered. Friends of Fiona remembered her not just as a face on a poster, but as a real person, a warm laugh, a quick wit, a fierce love for her family. One friend said in a later interview, "She was the kind of girl who never made a fuss, and I think that's why she stayed with people. You never forget someone who made life feel calm." Even now, in Awfully and Beyond, her name evokes emotion. She is the sister who vanished, the daughter who was taken, the mother who never got to hold her child. She became a symbol. But before she was that, she was simply Fiona. And in the homes of those who loved her, her absence still sits at the table, still leaves a seat, still casts a shadow across every birthday, every holiday, every silence. Life after the truth wasn't easier. It just became more honest. The people closest to her stopped hoping for a miracle and started hoping for peace. Some found it, some never will. But in every corner of Ireland where a missing person's case is still open, Fiona's story lingers like a ghost, a reminder of what happens when justice is delayed or denied. Fiona Pender's disappearance is no longer just a cold case. It's part of Ireland's collective consciousness, a mystery that has become more than unsolved. It has become unforgettable. Every few years her name reappears in the media. Sometimes it's in an article about cold cases. Sometimes it's a reference in a documentary about Ireland's missing women. Sometimes it's in the form of a candlelight vigil where no one needs to say her name because they all know it. And each time it starts again. The whispers, the questions, the ache. Because Fiona's case isn't over. Not really. It lives on in unanswered phone calls, in unsearched forests, in the eyes of mothers who still watch the door. It lives in legislation, too. In 2007, the Irish government introduced the Missing Persons Helpline, a national initiative that offers support to families, improves data collection, and ensures names like Fiona's aren't buried under bureaucracy. In 2015, Ireland expanded DNA profiling for unidentified remains, linking it with Interpol and other international cold case registries. Though Fiona's body has never been found, these changes reflect a growing effort to ensure future cases don't fall through the same cracks. But more than policy, Fiona's story lives on in culture. Her photo, that familiar black and white image with soft curls and searching eyes, has become a symbol of unresolved grief. It appears on posters, anniversary broadcasts, and social media tributes. Artists have painted her. Writers have written poems in her memory. Her name has been printed on T-shirts, memorial walls, and digital archives. And every year on August 23rd, people still gather, in silence, in solidarity, in sorrow. Some are family, some are strangers, but all of them are bound by the same thing, a refusal to let time erase her. In 2021, the Tullamore community organized a virtual memorial, streamed online due to the pandemic, where people lit candles in Fiona's name. Messages came in from across Ireland, and even from abroad. We remember, still waiting for answers. She should never have been forgotten. And even among a new generation, young people who were children or not even born when Fiona disappeared, there is awareness. In schools, she is sometimes mentioned in lessons about civic duty and justice. In university courses on criminology or gender violence, her case is used to explore investigative failures and media ethics. Fiona Pender has become more than a missing person. She is a reference point, a symbol, a story that lives on not just because it was tragic, but because it was allowed to vanish too quietly for too long. There's a reason why podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube channels continue to revisit her case, because we're not just drawn to the unknown, we're haunted by it. And Fiona's disappearance represents something many people fear, that someone can be loved, needed, seen, and still vanish without a trace, that justice can be out of reach, that silence can win. But the truth is, silence hasn't won. Because Fiona's story is still being told, it's told when a reporter revisits the case file, when a Garda recruits into the cold case unit and learns her name on day one, when a woman walks alone and remembers Fiona and moves faster. It's told when someone leaves flowers at the canal, or scribbles her name on the back of a missing persons flyer, or lights a candle in a window even when no one else is watching. And it's told here, right now, by you, the viewer, the listener, the witness. Because to speak her name is to defy the void. To remember her is to demand better. And in that sense, Fiona never disappeared. She became a question we keep asking, a light we won't let die, a mystery that lives on. She was 25, a hairdresser, a model, a daughter, a sister, a mother-to-be. And then she was gone, not in the way stories usually end, not with sound or struggle, but with a silence so complete It still grips the heart of a nation. Fiona Pender vanished on a warm August morning in 1996, and in the decades since, no one has told the full truth of what happened. Not the person who took her, not the one who kept quiet, not the ones who knew or guessed and said nothing. What remains are fragments: a locked apartment, a folded maternity outfit, a grieving mother who died waiting for an answer. Some say Fiona's story is a tragedy, but it's more than that. It's a mirror reflecting what happens when systems fail, when fear silences truth, and when justice becomes a whisper. Because Fiona didn't vanish alone, she vanished with her child, with every birthday unwrapped, with every milestone never reached. Her mother, Josephine, once said, "I don't need someone to be punished. I just want my daughter back. I want to bury her. I want to say goodbye." But she never got that chance. And so we're left with Fiona's name, written on posters, spoken in interviews, whispered in prayers, but still unanswered. And in that absence, the question hangs: did Fiona disappear, or was she erased? Was it a single moment of violence, or a chain of choices? Did the world fail to hear her cry, or was the silence the whole point? Because even now, in a world of surveillance, smartphones, and constant connection, people still vanish. Women still go missing. Mothers still wait. And every time we remember Fiona, we remember them too. There's a moment in every story when the listener must choose what to do with what they've heard. Do we move on? Or do we hold the silence accountable? Because somewhere out there, someone still knows what happened. Someone still wakes up and lives with it. And if you are that person, this story isn't over. You can change that. You can give her back. You can tell the truth. Fiona deserves more than whispers. She deserves a grave, not a question mark. A legacy defined by life, not by absence. And until that truth is spoken, we will keep saying her name. Fiona Pender. Not forgotten, not erased. Still waiting. What do you believe really happened? Because in stories like this, the truth doesn't just disappear. Sometimes it's still right here, buried beneath time, held in silence, waiting for someone to finally bring it home.